As promised, a more detailed story behind the creation of Barbie doll. Ruth Handler, who was born Ruth Moshko to the family of Jewish Polish descent, was the 10th child in the family. So by the time she was born, her older sister was pretty much taking care of her. Her older sister and her husband ran a drugstore, and that's where Ruth spent most of her adolescence, helping her sister and her husband run the drugstore. Eventually, Ruth met her future husband and they got married. They moved to LA, and Ruth was working in Paramount. Her husband had a hobby of creating light fixture from plastic. So Ruth convinced her husband to turn it into a side gig, and from that point forward, she spent her lunchtime, 1 hour of lunch that she had, going literally door to door, from store to store, trying to convince them to take her husband's work for resale. Eventually, she was able to close multiple contracts and land a big contract where they had to partner up with a business partner and form a company that's called Mattel. Matt for the business partner and Al for Elliot, Ruth's husband. Then Ruth convinced her business partners to start selling photo frames. And when the Second World War hit, there was a ban on plastic. It was restricted only for military use. So she suggested to use wood instead. And as soon as the company has done that, their orders doubled. And there are multiple other examples where Ruth pretty much pushed the company forward. She also managed the entire operations, grew the company exponentially. Ruth and Elliot had their own children. They had a daughter called Barbara and a son, Ken for short. So Ruth has been bearing this idea of having an adult girl toy, and the reason being is because she saw her daughter constantly playing with adult dolls but made out of paper, because that's the only ones that they had at the time, which was very inconvenient. You had to cut it out, the clothes always got loose, you had to like hook it on to the paper doll, and it got spoiled very easily. So she had this idea for multiple years, and then eventually when they went on a family vacation to Switzerland, in one of the stores she saw a similar doll that she was thinking in her mind. A plastic doll, a doll-looking doll. And turned out that the girls in Switzerland were buying, or the parents of those girls were buying those dolls for the girls to play with, even though that particular doll wasn't necessarily created for that use. But what it means is that there's this huge demand, right, for a product that's not being made. So with that, Ruth is convinced that her idea has extreme potential and that she's on the right path. And she presents her idea to the board, gets rejected by not just by her own board, but that idea gets brushed off by executives from other toy companies as well. It is perceived to be inappropriate because it's showing female body parts, and it's perceived irrelevant because the social stigma is that girls are supposed to play only with baby dolls, because ultimately that's what they would have to do, is take care of their children. So there's nothing else they should really be worrying about, dreaming of, or learning to do other than taking care of babies and obviously the household chores. So she got a lot of pushback, and yet she continued to push forth with her idea, iterating on the model to create the perfect doll. I say the word perfect with hesitancy because we all know what happened later when the doll actually became successful. But with that success also came different type of struggles and issues where the girls started to associate themselves exclusively with the appearance of the Barbie, and having eating disorders and all sorts of other issues around the appearance. But that's a whole separate subject. The purpose of this story is, number one, to show you that when you receive pushback, I like to say that if you get a lot of pushback, usually it means you're onto something, right? because if it was something irrelevant, nobody would care. If you receive a high reaction, be it positive or negative, it means you're onto something. Number two, what Ruth did, right? She did not create a separate market. The market and the demand was already there. All she did is listened and served to that consumer. And she did that brilliantly too, by the way. She, back in the day, all the advertising, even for toys, were targeted to parents because they are the buyers, right? They are the people with the money. And what Ruth did with Barbie is change the game completely, and with another product before Barbie actually as well. She went directly to the end user, to the end consumer, which means the child. So she partnered with Mickey Mouse Club to sponsor their program and run ads that way for another product. And then she did similar thing with Barbies, where she pushed the marketing directly targeting children as opposed to the parents. And being a parent myself, obviously that's the right, I'm thinking that's the best move to go, because I would brush that doll off and wouldn't even notice it. But of course, the children ultimately dictate to the parents what they want to play with. So that's number two. Number three is to show you that the gender discrimination and certain stigma and social stigma around women in particular has been around for years. And that story is almost 100 years old, pretty much, from the time Ruth was born. What she did is just one building block for the rest of us, right, to keep moving forward and keep pushing forward. So she created that doll and released it despite all the rejection, despite all the perception that women and girls are only here to create babies and care for the babies. And the purpose of Barbie was to allow girls to dream bigger than babies, to allow girls to dream what they could be: doctors, police officers, astronauts, teachers, artists, fashion designers, you name it. That was the main idea behind the doll, to create those other worlds for themselves and to build up that vision early on, and to build up that understanding that you're not bound to what your parents had to go through or had to be, and you can create your own path and follow your own path, and dream big dreams and achieve them as well. So that was the idea behind the doll. That was what Ruth was pushing for, and why she was so adamant about creating and releasing that doll to the world.